What if splashing paint on a canvas could make you one of the greatest artists in history? Would you call that genius or a scam? Jackson Pollock walked into a room and threw paint like a confession. Critics called it chaos. Collectors called it a revolution. He worked on the floor, moved around the canvas, making rhythm and accident into a language that had never existed before. To some, those drips are raw emotion given form. To others, they are a clever trick dressed up as meaning, a moment in which taste met hype and the market decided who mattered. He drank, he fought with himself, and his life was as messy as his work. But whether you see a fraud or a pioneer, Pollock forced the art world to ask something new. What counts as painting at all? This is the story of Jackson Pollock, the man who turned chaos into art and divided the world doing it. Before we begin, kindly hit the like and subscribe button, as this would really help support the channel.
I usually paint on the floor. I enjoy working on a large canvas. I feel more at home, more at ease in a big area. Having the canvas on the floor, I feel nearer, more a part of the painting. Sometimes I use a brush, but often prefer using a stick. Sometimes I pour the paint straight out of the can.
At the start of the 20th century, painting still wore the language of control. Artists trained their hands to measure space and light, to model form with careful strokes and exacting detail. A good painting showed the artist's skill, the way a polished instrument shows the craftsman's hand, composition balanced, perspective obeyed, the surface organized. You could read a painting like a sentence, subject, foreground, middle ground, background, all arranged so the eye moved where the painter intended. Art schools taught draftsmanship, weight of line, and the patient construction of image. Technique was visible, and with technique came a kind of trust. If the marks were careful, the work appeared honest. Artists like Edward Hopper and Thomas Hart Benton lived in that trust. Hopper painted light as silence, rooms and streets that held their solitude in place. His canvases were quiet arguments about distance and presence. Benton told stories with muscular, deliberate figures and sweeping compositional lines. His paintings guided the viewer through narrative and form. Audiences expected a recognizable world rendered by a steady hand. Critics rewarded control. The market rewarded craft. Painting for most viewers meant mastery made visible. Into that world walked a very different sensibility. Pollock did not pick up a brush to model a face or to organize perspective. He turned the canvas into a field and moved around it, acting on it. He poured, dripped, flung. The image was a record of movement, an event captured on linen rather than an illustration of a subject. Where earlier painters sought balance and clarity, Pollock sought density, rhythm, and the record of the artist's body in action. The mark became evidence of motion. Layers of paint recorded time, not just form. For many, this looked like an abandonment of skill. How could splatters and webs be judged by the same standards as careful draftsmanship? For others, it was an opening, a way to show psychological states, raw energy, and the physical presence of making. Pollock's canvases refused the frame as a window and instead created surfaces you stepped into with your eyes. He traded pictorial illusion for presence. At a time when art was about control, Pollock gave us the opposite, chaos. He replaced precision with movement, technique with impulse. That shift was explosive because it challenged the grammar of painting itself. If painting no longer needed to imitate or construct, then its purpose could be reimagined. To some observers, Pollock's method was liberating, a new language for feeling. To others, it looked like a stunt, an aesthetic shortcut wrapped in mythology. Either way, the rupture mattered. It pulled the conversation about art away from representational skill and toward gesture, process, and the politics of taste. That break would make some furious and others ecstatic, and it set the stage for everything that came next. It changed rules. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to invent a new style.
Jackson Pollock was the first American painter to capture the popular imagination.
And the modern artist has found new ways and new means of making his statement. It seems to me that the modern painter cannot express this age, the airplane, the atom bomb, the radio, in the old forms of the Renaissance or of any other past culture.
The drip arrived slowly, the result of experiments, influences, failures, and a stubborn refusal to do what everyone expected. Pollock's early life and training put him in contact with many ideas: regional American muralists who worked big and bold, encounters with Native American patterns, and the loose subconscious methods favored by European surrealists. But what turned those threads into something new was a simple practical move. He put the canvas on the floor. Working flat changed everything. Instead of standing in front of a framed picture and applying paint in layers that built an image, Pollock walked around his work. He could move freely on all sides. He could step into the space of the picture and let his body describe paths across it. This meant the painting became an action, not a plan. He poured from cans, flicked paint from sticks, dribbled color from brushes he didn't hold like a pencil, but like an extension of his arm. He sometimes used house paint, sometimes enamel, materials not traditionally associated with fine art, and that choice itself was a statement. The surface recorded motion, arcs, loops, webs of line laid down as his feet shifted, as his torso turned, as time passed. Pollock described what he wanted as energy made visible. That is not a flourish. It is a literal description of his method. Each line on a Pollock is a trace of an action. Paint becomes a map of movement. The canvas isn't a picture of something else. It is the document of a happening. He rejected the idea that a painting should present a window into a scene. Instead, he made surfaces you could inhabit with your eyes, complex, layered, and without a single center. There is no one place your eye must rest. The whole surface engages you. That all-over approach broke the grammar of composition people had learned for centuries. Native American sand painting is often cited as an early influence, and you can see why. The idea of making marks as ritual, as part of a process that has meaning in the doing, resonated with Pollock. Native sand painters also work with the ground as a surface and with pattern as a form of presence rather than depiction. Pollock adapted that sense of ritual and scale, but he grafted it onto modern anxieties and personal urgency. He was also interested in myth, in the unconscious, and in ways to let the hand move without the censor of deliberate depiction. That's why some of his experiments read like automatic writing in paint, spontaneous, urgent, and sometimes brutal. The birth of the drip was therefore technical and philosophical at once. Technically, it freed the mark from the brush held upright. Philosophically, it suggested that meaning could arise from movement itself. The drips and splatters are not accidents to be explained away. They are the point. They are how the artist's body, in a given place and time, left itself on linen. Critics and admirers later used different words. Some called it action painting, others abstract expression. But the practical fact remains. Pollock made paintings by performing them. That performance blurred authorship in a way that made people uncomfortable. If the image is the trace of an action, how much of the result is skill and how much is chance? Pollock answered that question not with lectures but with paintings. The control is not absent, it is redistributed. Control lives in rhythm, in the decisions to layer, to stop, to overlap, in the way color densities are balanced across a field. The hand is present, but so is accident. The work lives in that tension. For Pollock, painting wasn't about representation. It was about being inside the painting. His canvas was not a window, it was an arena. That sentence captures the moment of the drip's birth. The canvas becomes a space for a person to move through, to act in, to make visible the energy inside a body and a time. Whether you see liberation or a stunt, what Pollock did was change the rules about what a painting could be, simply by changing the way he painted it. When people call Jackson Pollock a genius, they aren't just talking about his fame or his rebellion. They're talking about how, in a single decade, one man expanded what painting could mean. Before Pollock, painting had boundaries. There was the brush, the canvas, the easel, and between them, a silent agreement that painting was about representation, or at least control. Pollock broke that contract. He took painting off the easel, removed the brush, and turned the act of creation itself into the art. In doing so, he didn't just change the image on the canvas, he changed the relationship between the artist and the work. He freed painting from the brush, and that single act became the foundation of a revolution. the drips, the splashes, the thick webs of paint. They weren't random gestures, as some critics assumed. They were carefully orchestrated layers of rhythm, balance, and density. When you stand before a Pollock, what you see isn't chaos. It's a record of time, of breath, of the body in motion. He made the invisible, emotion, movement, energy, visible. His canvases are not flat scenes, but living environments. They pull you in, surround you, make you feel what he felt in that moment of creation. For Pollock, painting became a form of performance. Years before performance art had a name. Every line, every arc, every drip of paint is a remnant of motion. Every drip, every splash, it was like he was painting motion itself. That was his true genius, to treat motion and gesture as material, to understand that meaning doesn't have to come from depiction, it can come from the physicality of making. Pollock opened the door to what became known as abstract expressionism, the first truly American art movement to dominate the world stage. Before him, Paris was the center of art. After him, New York was. His defiance, his scale, and his raw emotion turned America's cultural identity into something independent, bold, and unapologetically modern. Painters like Mark Rothko, Willem de Kooning, Franz Klein, and later Helen Frankenthaler all drew from his daring approach. They stopped worrying about what a painting should look like and started asking what a painting could do. Rothko, for example, stripped away everything but color and feeling, vast clouds of emotion floating in space. De Kooning brought back the figure, but twisted it with Pollock's energy, mixing control with abandon. Pollock gave them permission to be free, to paint emotion without narrative, and to value gesture as thought. That's the scale of his influence. Even outside the fine art world, Pollock's fingerprints are everywhere. Street artists, graffiti writers, and muralists have inherited his sense of motion and spontaneity. The way a graffiti artist layers color on a wall, improvising in rhythm to music or mood, that's Pollock's legacy, even if unconsciously. He taught that art can be physical, immediate, and unpolished, and still carry meaning. He dissolved the hierarchy between the proper artist and the human impulse to make marks. He also changed how people looked at paintings. A Pollock cannot be consumed in a glance. There's no center, no narrative. The viewer must walk around it, explore it, almost like entering a forest of color. It demands participation. You're not a spectator anymore. You're part of the experience. That interactive nature, decades before installations or immersive art, is part of why his work still feels contemporary. Pollock's paintings are often compared to music. There's rhythm, tempo, improvisation. Each layer of paint is like a beat or melody interacting with another. He once said, "I can control the flow of paint. There is no accident." That's crucial. He wasn't simply throwing paint. He was directing energy, letting intuition guide his choices. His genius lay in making chaos feel intentional, in turning disorder into balance. For artists, Pollock became a kind of permission slip, proof that you don't have to follow rules to make something profound. You can build meaning out of gesture, motion, and instinct. His success gave later generations the courage to explore beyond tradition. Conceptual artists, minimalists, and even digital artists all owe him a debt. He was the bridge between painting as craft and painting as raw consciousness. But genius doesn't always look neat. Pollock's art didn't offer comfort or clarity. It offered confrontation, with emotion, with scale, with uncertainty. His canvases are huge, consuming, and messy because he was trying to capture something vast, the feeling of being alive in a chaotic world. That's what his admirers saw, not confusion, but truth, the kind of truth that can't be drawn with straight lines or gentle strokes. In that way, Pollock redefined beauty. He replaced symmetry with spontaneity and harmony with movement. His paintings don't seduce, they challenge. They remind you that creativity isn't about perfection, it's about risk. Every line of paint is a decision, a breath, a moment caught forever. And that is why, even decades later, he still stands as one of the most influential painters of the 20th century. His work was not about making sense, it was about making presence. Pollock made the invisible pulse of creation visible. He transformed painting from a picture into an experience, from representation into revelation. Whether you admire him or not, you can't deny the scale of his impact. Because after Pollock, no one could ever paint the same way again. Many people looked at Pollock's canvases and didn't see revolution, they saw a joke. The most common barb was short and brutal. "My kid could do that." That line wasn't just insult, it was a challenge to the basic idea of skill. If a child's splash could look the same, what separated genius from accident? For a lot of viewers, the drip paintings appeared to bypass everything that used to make painting meaningful: draftsmanship, composition, the slow craft of making an image. If meaning could be manufactured by chance and a dramatic gesture, then what did the painter actually contribute? That skepticism opened up two related charges. The first was aesthetic. The drip is a gimmick dressed up as philosophy. Critics argued that Pollock's methods were theatrical tricks, a spectacle of motion and mess that relied on gallery lights and curatorial mystique to look important. Take away the story of the artist flinging paint, and what remained for some was a surface of accidental marks. The ritual of Pollock's technique, the canvas on the floor, the poured paint, the artist moving around like a conductor, became, in the eyes of detractors, part of the performance that created the value rather than the work itself. The second charge was about systems, that Pollock's rise was less about pure art than about marketing and cultural machinery. His career unfolded at a moment when a new art market and a profusion of powerful dealers, critics, and magazines could shape reputations quickly. Galleries knew how to sell a narrative, museums and journalists knew how to amplify it. Some critics suspect that talent alone didn't explain his meteoric fame. Instead, they point to the symbiosis between collectors seeking fresh icons and a media ecosystem hungry for dramatic stories. To these observers, Pollock's myth was cultivated as much as it was discovered. That theory deepens when you add politics. In the Cold War years, American cultural life became entangled with national prestige. There are widely circulated arguments and real historical evidence that abstract expressionism was promoted internationally as a proof of American freedom and cultural power. Some critics go further and claim Pollock's work benefited from cultural diplomacy and elite networks that had their own agendas. Whether you frame this as active manipulation or a historical coincidence, it feeds suspicion. Was Pollock's success a case of art meeting opportunity and politics rather than merit alone? Then there is the man himself, and his life doesn't help the myth. Pollock was a heavy drinker. He fought with his inner demons, and his behavior could be volatile. For many, these traits read as evidence not of tortured genius, but of instability. His public persona, the brooding alcohol-soaked artist, made it easy to romanticize him or to dismiss him. When a life looks messy, people ask whether the work is honest expression or a cover for chaos. His death in a car crash while driving drunk in 1956 crystallized that image, a brilliant flare extinguished by self-destruction. To some viewers, that history humanizes him. To others, it makes his art look like the product of a damaged man whose fame was out of scale with his craft. Market forces complicate the picture more. Once a handful of collectors and museums declared Pollock important, prices and attention followed. That cycle, taste creates demand, demand creates value, value validates taste, can look circular and self-reinforcing. When money and prestige are involved, art can be judged less on its intrinsic qualities and more on the stories that surround it. Critics who suspect the worst see Pollock's success as a case study in how myth and market can manufacture cultural capital. Finally, there is the hard question of authorship and luck. Pollock's method embraced chance. That's part of its radical appeal, but it also creates a vulnerability. If result depends on accident, how do you separate a masterful composition from mere happenstance? Pollock and his defenders argued that the difference lies in judgment, where to stop, how to layer, how to balance density across a field, decisions that reveal a disciplined eye. Skeptics reply that those distinctions are subjective, and subjective judgments are easy to shape with hype. All of these arguments converge on one blunt question. Did Pollock change the rules of painting because he discovered a new truth about art, or because he was the right man at the right cultural moment, helped along by savvy dealers, hungry press, and political currents? Was his method an honest expansion of what painting could do, or was it the first great marketing experiment in modern art where gesture and myth were sold as genius? Was Pollock a misunderstood genius, or the first great marketing experiment in modern art? Jackson Pollock's life reads like a parable of modern art, brilliant, volatile, and ultimately tragic. Behind the show of poured paint and celebrity, there was a private life riven by dependency and doubt. Pollock drank heavily for years, not a casual indulgence, but a force that shadowed his work, his relationships, and his judgment. Alcohol blurred the edges between control and chance. For an artist whose method embraced randomness, intoxication was sometimes indistinguishable from technique. He also struggled with persistent self-doubt. Success did not soothe him, it sharpened the questions. Was he an innovator or a lucky showman? Each praise, each auction result seemed to press him to perform again, to reproduce the miracle. Friends and acquaintances recalled mood swings, explosive tempers, and long silences where he retreated from the world. Lee Krasner, his wife and fellow artist, tried to anchor him, but fame made stability rare. Where the public saw a myth, the brooding genius, the private records show a man frequently at war with himself. Fame hollowed him as much as it crowned him. The art market and the press elevated Pollock into a figure far larger than the studio man could inhabit. Galleries and critics turned his experiments into icons. Collectors paid ever higher prices, and in that upward spiral, the person who made the painting sometimes receded behind the legend. That distance can erode an artist's center. When the world expects lightning, the human being spends life chasing it. His death in 1956, a car crash while driving drunk, sealed that tragic narrative. It is an image that fuels both sympathy and judgment, the brilliant creator undone by habit and impulse. Yet the tragedy also asks harder questions about responsibility. How much did the cultural systems that built Pollock's fame also fail to care for him as a person? Did the hunger for myth contribute to a neglect of the human being who produced the work? None of this excuses harmful behavior, but it does complicate how we read his canvases. The frantic webs of paint can be admired as daring invention, and they can also be read as traces of a life in turmoil, attempts to corral feeling through movement and surface. His art records motion and energy. It also carries the residue of someone testing the limits of self-control. Behind the dripping genius was a broken man, one who could never live up to the myth the art world built around him. That line is not an indictment of the work so much as a recognition that genius and suffering often sit together. Pollock's legacy is double-edged. He expanded our idea of what painting could be, and he left behind a cautionary tale about the cost of cultural celebrity. When you stand before a Pollock, you see both the audacity of invention and the human toll that invention implies, and how we treat those who burn themselves out for their work. So what was Pollock really? A fraud hiding behind chaos? A visionary who redefined painting? Or maybe both? Proof that genius often looks like madness until history decides otherwise. Think about the facts. He changed how paint could be used. He remade scale and space, and he forced the art world to ask a new question. What is a painting? But also think about the doubts, the splashes that looked simple to some, the market and media that amplified his myth, the man who drank himself to death under the weight of his own legend. History doesn't give tidy answers. Greatness and gimmick can occupy the same canvas. Innovation can be sincere or staged. Success can be earned or engineered. Suffering can be authentic or stylized into myth. Pollock's work sits at the intersection of those possibilities. His canvases record movement and presence. That's undeniable. How you name that, genius, fraud, or something in between, depends on what you value: craft, intention, impact, or story. So here's the last simple test I want you to try. Stand or sit, and imagine one of his large canvases filling your field of vision. Do you feel confronted, moved, annoyed, or emptied? Does the work demand meaning from you, or does it offer meaning on its own? Your reaction is a legitimate part of the verdict. I'm not handing you a judgment. I'm handing you the evidence, the method, the life, the feverish aftermath. What you choose to see in those drips says as much about you as it does about Pollock. Leave your verdict in the comments. Fraud, genius, or something more complicated? Tell me why.